The sudden violence of Pearl Harbor shattered the serene American tradition of consumption and peace, instantly replacing it with a national mandate for sacred sacrifice that extended from the factory floor to the kitchen table. The core tradition of the war became calculated consumption, managed not by dollars but by the ration book ritual, where every household meticulously budgeted red stamps for meat and blue stamps for canned goods, fostering a profound sense of shared hardship. This led to resourcefulness. Children became frontline soldiers in the scrap drive, collecting rubber and metal while mothers turned their yards into victory gardens, which supplied an incredible 40% of the nation's fresh produce, transforming a patriotic duty into the daily work of self-sufficiency. Simultaneously, the tradition of the homebound woman was irrevocably changed, as millions became Rosie the Riveter, embracing grease-stained overalls and paychecks, forging the war's weapons in steel and the nation's future in equality. Yet, all these sacrifices revolved around one central heartbreaking tradition, the vigil of waiting, symbolized by the service flag hung in every window, a blue star for service, a gold star for eternal loss. This vigil was sustained by the VML Lifeline, where families compressed their emotional messages onto microfilmed letters to bridge continents, holding onto hope through shared radio hours and community rituals like rolling Red Cross bandages and purchasing war bonds to finance 2/3 of the effort. When VJ Day finally arrived, the subsequent explosion of joy was layered with the bittersweet reality of veterans returning to a home front forever changed by the GI Bill, leaving behind a defining legacy not of the chaos of war, but of a quiet, enduring spirit of frugality, community, reliance and resilience that fundamentally redefined the American character. The economic sacrifice was quickly paralleled by a monumental shift in gender roles, cementing Rosie the Riveter not just as a propaganda image, but as a new national tradition of patriotic labor. With 11 million men gone, millions of American women traded domesticity for the din of the factory floor, embracing grease-stained overalls, wielding blowtorches, and earning unprecedented economic independence to forge the nation's weapons. This seismic societal change underpinned the most persistent and heartbreaking tradition of the home front, the vigil of waiting. Every family with a loved one overseas displayed a service flag in the window, a silent public testament to their private FIRA, blue star signifying service, a silver star, a wound, and the feared gold star signifying the ultimate sacrifice. This profound distance was bridged only by the VML Lifeline, where families compressed their emotional lives into microfilmed letters, trading lengthy prose for conservation of space, ensuring that love and hope, though fragile, could still cross continents. Community reliance flourished through radio hours, which served as a national town hall for news and shared morale-boosting entertainment, and through aggressive war bond drives, transforming neighborhood competition into a collective financial force that secured the war's funding and instilled lifelong habits of saving. The national call to use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without formalized scarcity into a point of patriotic pride, demanding sacrifices of both speed and comfort across the nation. To conserve precious rubber and gasoline for the troops, the federal government instituted a nationwide victory speed limit of 35 mph in May 1942, forcing Americans to drastically slow the pace of life and travel. Similarly, comprehensive rationing, which began with essentials like sugar in May 1942, compelled culinary creativity. The lack of items like coffee, canned goods, and meat solidified new domestic traditions like the Victory Garden and the meticulous saving of cooking grease. But perhaps the most immediate and psychologically demanding tradition was nightly compliance against enemy threat, especially on the coasts. Citizens rigorously practiced mandatory blackouts often, starting around 6 p.m. in the winter, ensuring that every window was covered and every light extinguished. This chilling, quiet ritual transformed every home into a defense post against potential aerial attacks, embedding the war's reality deeply into the American psyche every single night. The greatest tragedy of this wartime fervor was the betrayal of foundational American traditions for citizens of Japanese descent, a dark chapter often overlooked. Following the initial panic, Executive Order 9066 was signed on February 19, 1942, initiating the forced removal and internment of over 120,000 men, women, and children. 2/3 of whom were American citizens, into desolate camps like Monzanar and Tule Lake. This was a wrenching tradition of unwarranted suspicion, forcing families to abandon thriving farms and businesses with only what they could carry. The irony was profound. While their loyalty was questioned at home, the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese American volunteers, became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service, fighting and bleeding to uphold the very freedoms denied to their families back on the West Coast, proving their fidelity through unparalleled sacrifice. After 4 long years of sacrifice, the traditions of waiting gave way to 2 dates of spontaneous, chaotic release. When news of Germany's unconditional surrender broke on May 8, 1945, V-Day, the nation erupted in a collective, unbridled cry of relief, pouring into city streets from Times Square to Main Street for an impromptu, nationwide celebration. This raw joy was dwarfed only by the ecstatic, definitive celebration on August 15, 1945, VJ Day, when Japan's surrender was announced, igniting the famous, emotional kiss between a sailor and a nurse in Times Square, a single image that captured the nation's overwhelming relief that the bloodshed was finally over. Yet, beneath the parades and champagne, the somber tradition of the Gold Star family remained, ensuring the national exuberance was always tempered by the quiet, permanent grief for the 405,000 American lives that would never return home. The final, lasting tradition of the war was the promise of a future secured for those who fought, enacted through the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill. This revolutionary piece of legislation fundamentally reshaped post-war America, offering veterans access to subsidized education and low interest, zero down payment, home loans. Starting in 1946, this entitlement did more than simply help veterans transition. It triggered a massive cultural and economic boom, leading to the creation of the American suburb and democratizing higher education, allowing millions of working-class Americans to attend college for the first time. This act solidified the notion that sacrifice abroad would be rewarded with opportunity at home, cementing a new tradition, a belief in broad government investment that built the prosperity and middle class that defined the second half of the 20th century. The GI Bill was not merely financial aid, it was the mechanism that transferred the home front's spirit of resourcefulness and investment into a framework for lasting prosperity, causing an immediate and staggering impact. By 1947, veterans constituted nearly half of all students in the nation, crowding campuses and fundamentally democratizing access to higher education previously reserved for the elite. Consider the true story of Sergeant John L. Williams from Brooklyn, who, never finishing high school, used his stipend to earn an engineering degree at New York University. He was one of nearly 8 million veterans who used the education benefit, forever altering the intergenerational fate of working-class families and creating the most highly skilled workforce in the world. Simultaneously, the promise of low-interest home loans drove the creation of the American suburb. In places like Levittown, New York, beginning in 1947, standardized, affordable housing was mass-produced, fulfilling the tangible American dream for families who could now afford a stake in the land they fought for. This was the moment the nuclear family, having survived global conflict, settled into a new tradition of stability and upward mobility, building a physical barrier against the anxiety of the Great Depression and the horror of the war they had just endured. Yet, the tradition of the hero's welcome often masked the silent, emotional price paid by the returning 16 million men and women. The war's end brought the difficult tradition of reintegration, where a veteran's profound psychological scars, the shell shock or battle fatigue, were met with little public understanding. Wives, who had achieved self-reliance as Rosie the Riveter, now navigated complex, new roles as their husbands struggled with night terrors and emotional withdrawal. This domestic battle, fought quietly with patience and resilience, was the last great sacrifice of the home front. But this hard-won stability led to the final, joyful, and defining tradition, the baby boom. Starting sharply in 1946, the combination of deferred family planning, the economic security provided by the GI Bill, and an overwhelming desire for peace and normalcy resulted in an explosion of births. This mass creation of a new generation symbolized the ultimate victory, the ability to plan a future, confidently invest in life, and finally enjoy the traditions of prosperity and family that the sacrifices of the home front had secured. The legacy of World War II in America is ultimately the story of a nation that won the war, not just with ships and guns, but with shared stamps, collected grease, and the profound, enduring promise of a better tomorrow. But the transition to peace was not instantaneous. The sudden flood of returning servicemen and the burgeoning baby boom immediately triggered a massive housing and infrastructure crisis, transforming the traditions of frugality into a desperate scramble for space. Universities were overwhelmed, forcing veterans like the aforementioned Sergeant Williams to attend classes in Quonset huts and temporary trailers. The federal response, while slow, rapidly accelerated the growth of communities like Levittown. However, the end of the war also meant the end of collective sacrifice. Rationing, which had governed life since 1942, was systematically dismantled, culminating in the removal of almost all controls by 1946. This sudden release ignited the largest consumer spending spree in American history, marking the true end of the home front's traditions of scarcity and the beginning of modern consumer culture. For many women, however, the end of the war meant an enforced return to traditional gender roles. By late 1945, surveys showed that the majority of women working in heavy industry were laid off. Their tradition of economic independence abruptly halted, even as the stability of the family unit was prioritized above all else. The true architects of the home front's resilience, however, were the American families themselves, who transformed every house into a shared theater of the war effort. They were the ones who carried out these traditions daily, turning abstract patriotism into concrete action. The ration book was not just a scarcity control, but a tool for teaching equity, as parents ensured older siblings understood why younger ones got less sugar in their cereal. The routine of a mother carefully cutting out her husband's face from a family photo to maximize space on a V-mail microletter became an intimate tradition of emotional conservation. Meanwhile, children, galvanized by the scrap drives, internalized a lifelong sense of civic duty, seeing their collected rubber tires directly tied to the soldiers they cheered on in the weekly meet. These families, whether crowded into a newly purchased Levittown home or awaiting a telegram with dread, forged an indelible shared purpose and learned a profound resilience. They emerged from the war not merely as survivors, but as a generation defined by its ability to turn deprivation into innovation, cementing a tradition of collective action that became the emotional bedrock of the post-war American middle class. The legacy of these wartime years didn't vanish with the repeal of rationing. It became a permanent psychological inheritance for the baby boomer generation. Children who grew up hoarding aluminum foil and digging victory gardens carried that tradition of scarcity as stubborn, deeply ingrained frugality into the age of affluence. Even as the economy roared in the 1950s, many mothers continued to cut food waste, save string, and mend clothes, a quiet, almost automatic devotion to conservation learned during the desperate years of 1942 to 1945. This was the transmission of the greatest generation ethos, a moral curriculum taught not in schools, but in the trenches of the kitchen. The children of the war learned that civic virtue was not just voting, but participating in neighborhood watch, contributing to local drives, and believing in collective national effort. This shared memory of the home front, the knowledge that they had, collectively saved the world with their stamps, and their silence during blackouts cemented a powerful, though often quiet, tradition of communal strength that would define their values for decades, even as the new suburbs promised individuality and endless prosperity. The collective psychological strain of the war, coupled with the decade of the Great Depression that preceded it, created an intense post-war aversion to chaos and instability. The tradition of restraint, learned during the blackouts and the anxious wait for mail, translated directly into the social conformity of the 1950s. Veterans and their families sought refuge in the predictable rhythm of suburban life, where the uniformity of Levittown homes offered a psychological antidote to global turmoil. The children of the home front, the baby boomers, were raised by parents who actively suppressed the emotional costs of the war shell shock, grief, and the fear of scarcity in favor of a robust, optimistic facade. This quiet tradition of emotional stoicism defined the family unit. Parents rarely spoke of the trauma, but ensured their children understood the value of hard work, financial security, hence the deep savings habits, and unquestioning loyalty to national ideals. Thus, the home front traditions were ultimately internalized as a complex, unspoken generational contract, stability at the price of complete candor. The deep-seated traditions born of the home front frugality, collective civic action, and emotional stoicism have largely faded from the mainstream American experience, primarily due to decades of unprecedented affluence and seismic cultural shifts. The economic engine the veterans built, fueled by the GI Bill, ironically eroded the wartime culture of scarcity. Frugality was replaced by consumerism and planned obsolescence, making use it up, wear it out an impractical concept in a world of cheap, disposable goods. The intense, unquestioning civic conformity and communal strength dissolved amidst the complexity of the Cold War, Vietnam, and subsequent hyper-individualism. The shared national purpose that drove war bonds and scrap drives became fragmented into polarized political discourse. Most significantly, the tradition of emotional stoicism, the unspoken contract of stability at the price of complete candor, was overtly challenged and ultimately broken by the succeeding generations. The rise of pop psychology, mental health awareness, and digital culture in the late 20th and early 21st centuries demanded the very candor and transparency the greatest generation had suppressed, leaving the wartime traditions alive mainly as nostalgic artifacts rather than guiding principles of modern American daily life. The profound, unspoken rules that governed the greatest generation were not simply passed down, they were rejected by their grandchildren, creating a deep cultural schism in American values. The baby boomers, raised on the home front's creed of security and suppression of emotion, sought to provide their children, the millennials and Gen Z, a life free from scarcity. But this very affluence inadvertently severed the tradition of frugality. For the wartime generation, saving string and washing aluminum foil was patriotic survival. For the new generations, it was a quirky, often irritating habit of their grandparents. Crucially, the unspoken generational contract of stability at the price of complete candor, the bedrock of the 1950s family, was directly challenged. Millennials and Gen Z, prioritizing mental health and authentic self-expression, actively sought to dismantle the stoicism that caused their grandparents and parents so much quiet distress. This shift was fueled by the rise of the internet, which fragmented the singular national narrative provided by the 1940s radio hour and replaced it with millions of individual voices, demanding transparency over traditional emotional restraint. The logistical traditions of the war, meanwhile, became utterly irrelevant due to systemic and technological change. The need for a ration book vanished with the advent of robust global supply chains, making the notion of domestic food scarcity unimaginable for most of the population. The community-wide blackouts and victory speed limits were rendered moot by peace and, eventually, by GPS and 24/7 public lighting, removing the essential, shared public ritual of collective compliance. Most dramatically, the need for a VML lifeline was obliterated by instant, asynchronous digital communication. Soldiers' face-to-face video chat or a direct text message is the polar opposite of the delayed, heavily censored microfilmed letter. The traditions disappeared because their core purpose to manage scarcity, censorship, and massive physical distance was solved not by sacrifice, but by technology and commerce. The American consumer culture, the economic victory of the war, ultimately consumed the very traditions that had created it. Yet, the spirit of the home front traditions persists in powerful, fragmented echoes, often re-emerging during times of modern crisis or cultural movements. While the war is long over, the concept of decentralized community action has returned in the form of the sustainability and climate movements, where local community gardens and farm-to-table initiatives directly mirror the self-sufficiency goals of the Victory Garden. The scrap drive lives on in formalized, government-mandated recycling programs, which now ask for meticulous sorting and collective compliance, albeit for environmental rather than military necessity. Furthermore, the commitment to service members remains a powerful modern tradition, though decentralized. Instead of rolling bandages for the Red Cross, citizens now participate in widespread online movements to send care packages and support military families, a digital evolution of the physical, community-based support system that defined the original home front. These modern echoes prove that while the specific sacrifices are gone, the underlying American impulse for collective resilience and civic participation remains a potent, if highly modernized, force.